Yes, these are the possible syllogism possible. We're going to eliminate all the ones that are invalid. You're going to see how many possible arguments you could get that people would give you as syllogisms. EEs, EOs, OOs, and OEs. Right? Because the E's and the O's are your negative. So you can't have two negative premises. Yeah, very good. Okay. Everybody's on with that. You should have 64 crossed off. Okay. Rule number 4 is a valid syllogism cannot have a negative premise and an affirmative conclusion. So let's go in the upper left-hand quadrant. We'll deal with the A major premises over here. Okay, so you can't have a negative premise and an affirmative conclusion. So obviously, nothing in the AAs, those are both affirmatives, that first bank, nothing's going to be eliminated there. But the E's and the O's are negative. So you have a negative premise there. So the ones that have the A conclusion, that's an affirmative conclusion, or an I conclusion, those two lines can be crossed out. Does that make sense? So if you have the AE, the E's are negative premises, so the minor premise, if it's the E statement is in the minor position, you have a negative premise. But if you have an affirmative conclusion, that's what you're looking for. So the AEA1, AEA2, AEA3, and AEA4 can be crossed off, right? And the AEIs can also be crossed off. Okay, so then the if you go down to the fourth set of A's, the AOA, 1, 2, 3, 4, you have the O as a negative premise and the A is an affirmative conclusion, right? So that line of 4 can be crossed off. And you'll skip a line because you have a negative conclusion on the second line, but you have an affirmative conclusion on the AOI 1, 2, 3, and 4. Does that make sense? Okay. Going down to the E bank of questions on that first set of 4. The E is a negative premise. So if we have a positive conclusion, an affirmative conclusion, that's going to violate it. So the EAA 1, 2, 3, and 4 can all be crossed off. Skip a line because you have a negative conclusion in the EAEs, but the EAI statements can all be crossed off. And we already crossed off all the EE, so now then you're going to skip another bank of 4, go down to the EIA, affirmative conclusion. You have a negative premise, so the EIAs can be crossed off, and the I's can be crossed off. Does that make sense? Now you can go over to the I bank over on the right-hand side. So the second row down, or the second set of fours, the IEA. The A is the affirmative, and the I is a negative. One more time. I'm sorry. The E is the negative. You're right. Sorry, I stand corrected. So the E is the negative. The A is the affirmative. So that line would be crossed off. Then you'd skip the IEE, but the IEI bank can be crossed off. You'd skip the IIA because those are affirmatives. But the O statement is negative, so the IOA, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the IOI, 1, 2, 3, 4, would be crossed off. Everybody's tracking. Then on the O bank, the OAA line would be crossed off, and the OAI line would be crossed off. That's all. So somebody tell me what would be the next two lines that we would cross off. There's 8 more on this sheet. OIA, very good. And then what's the last set of 4? OII, that's right. So you can see the pattern that is given there, especially if you're doing them in different colors. Okay, does anybody have any question on that? Fairly simple. Okay. Mike, you tracking? Somewhat. You know the negative premises. Yeah, somewhat. Okay.
So you can have 2 positive premises and a negative conclusion.
That's our next rule. Just because we've crossed these off doesn't mean that the rest are all valid. So we're going to continue on. But you just crossed off another 64 of those, right? Is that right? 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, yeah. So 64, that's 128. So we're halfway there. Easy cheesy, huh? Okay, the next one is a valid syllogism cannot have 2 affirmative premises and a negative conclusion. So we're going to look for our major and minor premises that are AA, and you can't have 2 affirmatives. Yeah, so I was about to go over here to this. You can not have AA with an E or an O conclusion. You can't have an AI with an E or an O conclusion. You can't have an II with an E or an O, or an IA with an E or an O conclusion. So all those combinations would be crossed out. Okay? That's hard to keep track. So let's go through them. 2 affirmative premises. So now on the A bank, we'll just do that set. If you have 2 A's as a premise and you have an E or an I conclusion, those can all be crossed off. So you got 2 lines, right? An E or no, I'm sorry. E or O conclusion with 2 A's as the premises, those would be crossed off. Okay. Now, if you have an AI with an E or an O conclusion, those can be crossed off. And then you would go to the right, because our two banks of affirmative premises. The IA with an E or an O conclusion, those can be crossed off. And the II with E or O conclusions would be crossed off. So that's another 32 there. So that's 160, 170. Is that right? Let me see, 10. 160. 160 eliminated. Easy cheesy, right? If it can only continue. So that was 15 minutes and we got so many done, but now is where it gets a little bit sticky. Okay, the rule number 1 is a little bit easier to deal with than the rule number 2. So I think we go to that one first, and that is, in at least one premise, the middle term must be distributed. Yeah. Okay, so let's just go back and review the distributed terms, because that's probably what's going to give you some difficulties. So we have a major term, a minor term, or a major premise that we symbol by a P, a minor premise with an S, and the conclusion we have 3 dots, right? When we have our conclusion, we have a subject, are or are not, and then we have a predicate, right? Oops, sorry, not PP, SP. In your conclusion, your predicate term is going to appear in your major premise is going to contain the predicate of the conclusion. Do you remember that? Unfurl those eyebrows, Mr. I want lights going on. You go to the conclusion, the predicate term, whatever that is. Let's say we have all men are mortal. That's going to be our major premise. Our minor premise is Dr. Kiter is a man. Now, we haven't determined that to be true. That could be a false statement, but anyhow, okay. I'm doing this the old way, and I'm probably standing in front of you. So that's going to be our minor premise. Our conclusion is, therefore, Dr. Kiter is mortal. Okay, so what is our major term? What's that? Yeah, the major term is going to be mortal. It's the predicate of our conclusion, right? And it appears in our major premise. It is in the predicate position of the major term.
Would that be in figure 1?
We haven't determined that yet, because it could be figure 1 or it could be figure 3, right? The subject, Dr. Kiter, appears in our minor premise. This is our subject term, and it appears here. In this case, our middle term is the term that appears in both premises but does not appear in the conclusion. And there are four possible orientations for where your middle term is going to appear in your major and minor premises. The middle term could be in the subject position of the major and the predicate position of the minor. That would be a figure 1. In figure 2, it would be the middle term appears in the predicate position of both the major and the minor premise. It appears in the subject position of both major and minor in figure 3, and then in figure 4, the middle term is in the predicate of the major and then the subject position of the minor premise. Okay, that's review.
What makes it a middle term?
It's the term that appears in both premises, but not in the conclusion. In this case, men,
Not in the conclusion.
and not in the conclusion, that's right. So if I were to circle this, that would become a little bit more apparent to you. We have the predicate term of the conclusion, which is our major term. So this is where these two rules are going to get a little bit confusing, because we have to distinguish between a middle term, and the middle term, and then the term of the conclusion in rule 2. If a term is distributed in its conclusion, it must also be distributed in its premise, which that's the challenge, because you're going to want to go back to finding where the middle term is and take that as a position. I think that's where we get hung up on this particular exercise. So let's deal carefully with rule 1, then we'll deal carefully with rule 2. So in at least one premise, the middle term must be distributed. So let's start with the A bank. If you have an conclusion, or figure 1, an A conclusion has a subject that is distributed. If the subject, I'm going to rule 2, let me back up here. In one premise, we have to have a middle term distributed. So in the A, if this is our A and this is our A, one of those has to have a middle term distributed. The A has the subject distributed, and this is distributed, but that's not. So the middle term on an AA, the minor term would not be distributed, but the major term would. Does that make sense? The subject,
So the middle term is
remember,
equal to a minor.
let's go back over here. All SRP, we have the S is distributed, the P is not distributed.
Okay, so for the first, that would be equal to the first line of the example, the A. That would be the the mortal would not be
The mortal is not distributed, but Dr. Kiter would be.
Yes.
Very good. So in the E statement, both the S and the P are distributed. No S or P. There you can. Being distributed says it has something that applies to the whole class. So all covers all of S, but it doesn't cover P. All squirrels are animals. We're talking about all squirrels, but all animals may not. Animals is bigger than that. In an I statement, neither S or P are distributed. And in an O, the P is distributed. Right? So, if a term is distributed in the conclusion, that's right. I'm sorry, at least one of the premises has to have a distributed term. So if we're dealing with I statements, we don't have to worry about that. There's no distribution. So we're not going to have to worry about that. The two I's. So all, the I's, if you have two I statements, we know that it doesn't matter what form it's in.
So I have the IIA and IIO that are not crossed off yet.
IIA and III, you can cross those off. Right? So now, I guess as long as we're here on dealing with the I's, the two premises that have the I's, we can cross that off. So that whole bank is cleared now, right?
Should the IIO be crossed off?
The IIO, that was already crossed off on under number 5. That violated rule number 5, so that should have already been crossed out. So all of those double I's, that whole bank should now be completely closed off. Okay. Well, the two I premises, major and minor I's, you have no distribution. There's no possible way that you could have those distributed, right?
But you can have an I as a conclusion, or not?
All we're doing is that we're dealing with at least one premise. The middle term must be distributed. Yeah, so I apologize if I gave indication then. Okay, so let's start up at the top. The IAA1. We know that the I in the major term doesn't have a distributed term. The A has a subject that is distributed. So in the minor premise, you have an A statement, which the S is distributed, but the middle term in that would not be distributed, right? Back up again. Okay, the IAA, if you have the I as a major premise, we know that neither of those neither position is distributed, so the middle term would not be distributed in the major term. And in the minor, it's an A, IA, the subject of an A statement is distributed, and our middle term is in the predicate position on figure 1. so it is not distributed. The S is the distributed position. So that would get crossed off. And the same thing with the IA2, the A, the minor premise, the subject position, your middle term is in the predicate position on figure 2. It's in the subject position on 3 and 4. So IAA3 and IAA4, those two do have a distributed premise. The term is distributed in the premise. Does that make sense? You following? Is that what? Somewhat. Okay, so now the IAI1, IAI1. If the I is in the major premise, we know that neither of those are distributed. That means that the major premise doesn't have a distributed middle term. The A in the minor position on figure 1, it doesn't have a middle term distributed because the subject is distributed on an A statement. So neither the major or the minor on a figure 1 is distributed. And the same thing, because the middle term for figure 2, the A, so the IAI2 also does not have a middle term that's distributed. So that would give you four that you can cross out on that upper bank of 16. So the IAA1 and the IAA2 are crossed out. The IAI1 and the IAI2 are also crossed out. Okay? Okay, so the IEE1 and 1, 2, 3, and 4, I don't want to waste the time going through this. I'm just going to skip that second bank because I know that we're going to cross those out on the rule number 2, and I want to have some exercise there. But we already crossed out the IIA 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the III 1, 2, 3, and 4, because in that bank both premises are I statements that don't have a subject or a predicate, so it doesn't matter what position your middle terms fall into. That's going to be eliminated. Okay, then on the last bank of 16 under the I major premises, the IOE1, IOE1, the major premise is an I, which neither are distributed in the I. The O statement has the predicate position is distributed. So if this is an O statement, the predicate position, the middle term is in the predicate position on, is this right? Yeah, the O, hang on a second. Yeah, right. So it is distributed because the O statement has the predicate position distributed. So the figure 1 and the figure 2, your middle term is in the predicate position on the IOE combination. So 1 and 2, we can't cross off. but the middle term is in the subject position on 3 and 4. So the 3 and the 4 you would cross off. The IOE3 and IOE4, and the IOO3 and the IOO4 could be crossed off. But the 1s and the 2s have to remain for the time being. Okay? What's that? Okay. So that is going to be a little bit easier to work through. I think in the time remaining, maybe I'll let you try to finish off those. The last discipline is if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it must also be distributed in its premise. Okay, so this I think is the most complex one. Let's deal with the AAA1. So we have all men are mortal, all Dr. Kiter is a man, all Dr. Kiter is mortal. That is an AAA1 because men is in the subject, the middle term is in the subject position here, and it's in the predicate position in the minor, correct? So, if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in its premise. So in this case, we have A statements. The subject position is distributed. So Dr. Kiter is a distributed term in the conclusion. Correct? So its premise, it must be distributed here as well. So in this case, you're going to look to the minor premise of an A statement in the conclusion. You're looking at the minor premise, the subject position, finding out if this is distributed, and it is an A statement. It's in the subject position, therefore it's distributed. So this form passes the test of the second rule. That's what you're looking at. If a term is distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in its premise. So it's a little bit more to kind of figure out the distribution. If you have O or an I statement, you're going to have to look at both the major and the minor terms. You don't have to worry about it with the I's. And in the O statements, you're looking at the major term for distribution. So I think in this case, you can eliminate your I's, having to worry about that, work with these two, and try to eliminate as much as you can, and then deal with your E statements. So that's why we'll do the A's and the O's and try to go through that. So the AAA1 should be open on your, that's not crossed off yet, correct?
I think it's already crossed off.
AAA1 should not be crossed off. AAE1 should be crossed off. That AAE, because you have two affirmative premises and a negative conclusion, right? And the AAOs are crossed off, that's right. Okay, so now let's go to the second one, the AAA2. We have the subject term in the conclusion is distributed. So we're looking at the minor premise, and in the minor premise on figure 2, the minor term, in this case, as an A statement, has the subject position where your term is going to go into that subject position, so it would be distributed.
This is
AAA2, correct. In the AAA3, however, you have the middle term is in the subject position, which means that it would not be distributed, because now you have your subject term of your conclusion in the predicate position on number 3, so that would get crossed off on the basis of rule number 2. And the same logic applies to 4. Right? Your middle or your minor term is going to be in the predicate position. So you have a minor term, major term, and middle terms. And this is where you don't confuse this with that previous rule where we're just looking at the middle term. Now we're looking at the major and the minor terms, where they are. Okay?
So AA 3 and 4 are off.
Are crossed off, that's right. Okay? Do you see how that plays out? So that's what you're going to be doing on these other 2 rules. I was hoping maybe we could get through this and completely finish, but we're basically out of time. But work with this maybe one more week and see if you can't hammer out those 2 rules, those 2 last ones, and then we'll give you the actual ones and confirm that we've got those, okay? And call me up if you have any questions on that, because I think next week I'm going to go ahead and start pressing on to the next section. Okay? But you see what you're doing here? I would write this out on your paper. Have clear in your mind what is how the distribution plays out. Remember, the subject terms of the universals are distributed, and the predicates of the negatives are distributed. If you want to think about it that way. Or you could say the predicates of the affirmatives are not distributed, and the subjects of the particulars are not distributed. You could do it that way too. Eyes don't have, any distribution. Correct. So you're not going to have to worry about that on that whole section. Okay? Is that fun? Huh? A little bit challenging. It's a good stretch. I imagine if you tried to do this, it was probably frustrating. This is why I have to keep repeating this. Even for me, have to wait. Pause a moment, think through this, and I've been through this twice, 3 times, and it's still, trying to get it a little bit tighter. Okay? All right, next week, come back with this finished. Right? I think it was 24 syllogisms that are legitimate, right? So you should get this reduced to 24 that are not crossed off. That's when you get to say you're done with your homework. Yes, sir?
Are you and your wife in agreement on that yet?
She's wrong.
Are you and your wife in agreement on that yet?
Yes, she agrees with me.
She agrees with you?
Yeah. She was thinking there was 19, but it is actually 24. Yeah. Okay? Let's close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this stretch of our minds. We know there's a lot of technical stuff here, and we confess that this is not our ordinary path of thinking. But I pray that we might just be more aware, even of a general sense, that bringing together valid, legitimate argumentation is a very important discipline, and we see how many bad arguments really can be made. So help us to be better at giving a defense for the hope that lies within us and being a brighter light to this world, for, speaking truth and speaking in a way that makes logical sense and grammatically defends the faith that cannot be assaulted. And we ask your mercies and blessings. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay.